Welcome to our Chapter 5 lecture on cognitive growth. This chapter focuses only on Piaget and Vygotsky. Chapter 6 is also about cognitive growth, but it focuses mostly on the information processing theory. So these are theories that were discussed in Chapter 1 that you should have read about and should be familiar with these players here. Most of this chapter is about Piaget, and we'll just talk about Vygotsky a little bit at the end. Piaget's cognitive theory includes 4 stages of cognitive growth from birth through adolescence. So we're mostly going to be going through those stages. And I have some video examples to show you to make it a little easier to understand what he was talking about. So according to Piaget, as children are growing physically, they're also going through a series of universal stages in a fixed order, which means that every child, no matter what culture they grew up in, is going to go through these stages in the same order. So they're the sensory motor stage, pre-operational, concrete operations, and then formal operations. And like I said, it ends at adolescence. Your textbook talks about some other theories in cognitive development that are focused more on adulthood, so you should read about those as well. Basically, according to Piaget's view, he focused a lot on physical maturation and also experience with the environment, which you'll see some examples of here in a second. But before we get to that, Piaget believed that infants have mental structures called schemes, which are organized patterns of sensory motor functioning. So for infants, you already know about the reflexes from the physical development chapter. So we know that reflexes are things that just happen without any thought. That's the key here when we're talking about cognitive growth, is we're talking about actual cognition, like thoughts. So infants have reflexes that they don't have to think about and their bodies just do it. So like sucking was one of the reflexes that was discussed. Where if you put something in the baby's mouth, they're going to suck on it. So a scheme would be different. So they have a sucking reflex, but the infants also have a sucking scheme where they have an understanding now. So we're talking about thoughts now, that if they put something in their mouth, it might taste good, it might feel good, it might bring them pleasure. So this is a lot different than just having a reflex to do something without any thought behind it. So there are 2 principles that underlie the growth in children's schemes: assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is when people understand and experience in terms of their current stage of cognitive development and way of thinking. So if a baby is given something new, let's say a comb, a baby doesn't know what to do with a comb, so they're going to assimilate this new experience into their current cognitive development and way of thinking. So they might stick it in their mouth because they are assimilating the comb into their sucking. Now, accommodation occurs whenever a person actually changes their existing ways of thinking, and this happens in response to encounters with new stimuli or new events. So you have an actual change happening here. So sticking with our example, eventually the baby learns that combs don't taste good and don't bring any pleasure or food. So then they might learn how to actually use the comb to comb their hair, or maybe comb a hair. So that's accommodation, where they've changed their way of thinking now, and they're not using it to chew on, but actually using it for its actual purpose. So you have an assignment about assimilation and accommodation. So you can use those examples to kind of get you started on coming up with your own examples for infants, and also examples for adults as well. Okay, but now move on to talking about the first stage in Piaget's theory on cognitive development, which is the sensory motor stage. So this stage lasts from birth to about 2 years old. And this stage actually has 6 different substages. So we're going to watch a video on that. So just a second while I switch my screen to show you the video.
Piaget's work provides us with a theoretical model, which helps us classify and understand all the development that goes on in a child's life. In this chapter, we will learn about Piaget's stage theory of development. We'll take a look at how infants fit into the sensory-motor stage, as well as examine each of the 6 substages that make up the sensory-motor stage. Piaget's theory is based on stages, where each stage builds upon the last, and each stage has substages. These stages are not descriptions of the underlying biological process that drive development. Instead, they form a theoretical model. This can be used as a shorthand for discussing and understanding the elements of development. Infants are in the sensory-motor stage. It has 6 substages. There is a gradual transition from one stage to the next. During these transitions, an infant's behavior exhibits characteristics from both the stage it's leaving and the stage it's moving to.
In the life of an infant, he actually comes here with reflexes. These are simple actions where he responds to simple stimuli. An example of this would be placing your finger in the palm of a baby. The infant automatically closes his palm. As he experiences this action and other actions in his world, it becomes more complex. It starts evolving to more of a sensory motor action where, in addition to just closing his hand, he may actually bring your hand to his mouth so that he can experience it in another way.
The stage of simple reflexes generally extends through the first month of life. These reflexes are unlearned, involuntary responses to outside stimuli. These include rooting, turning their heads towards something that touches their cheek, sucking, the tendency to suck at things that touch their lips, and stepping, the movement of legs when they are held with their feet touching the floor. At this stage, babies are simply reacting to their world. But the more new experiences they have, the more they begin to learn about and alter their behavior. Let's say a baby is breastfed, also receives supplemental bottle feedings, and uses a pacifier. Over time, he learns differences between each of the activities and changes the way that he sucks. The second substage is first habits and primary circular reactions. This takes place from about month 1 to 4. In this stage, an infant begins to combine separate actions into one activity. For example, they coordinate grasping an object with sucking on that object. The word circular in the name of this stage comes from the fact that babies tend to do these combined activities over and over and over again. Why? Because they enjoy it. They learn that they have some control over the feelings they experience. An infant's hand works its way into her mouth by accident, which causes her to suck on it. The feeling is a good one, so she begins to do it repeatedly. The word primary in the name of this stage indicates that focus of the activity involves themselves, their own bodies. In this case, his hand. The third substage is secondary circular reactions. This takes place from about month 4 to 8. Here, infants begin to learn that they have an effect on their environment. They interact with objects around them, and when that interaction results in a pleasing effect, they repeat it. This baby grasps a toy that makes a jingling noise and begins to shake it. She may notice that the sound of the jingle changes depending on how it is shaken. She then spends a significant amount of time shaking it to experience the various sounds it makes. In this stage, circular again means a repeated action, but secondary refers to an infant's interaction with the world outside of her own body. The fourth substage is coordination of secondary circular reactions. This takes place during months 8 through 12. During this time, infants engage in goal-directed behavior, which involves the understanding of cause and effect relationships. They are now building upon their development from the first 3 stages. They behave in ways that they know will cause a desired effect, or even solve a problem. Some of this knowledge involves the concept of object permanence, which is the understanding that objects and people exist, even when they cannot be seen.
Object permanence is important for a baby's cognitive development as well as their emotional development. As soon as a baby can conjure up an image of a person or an object in their brain, they're capable of cognitive thought. And that's the beginning of reflection, imagination, planning. And so for the first time, a baby is able to plan for the future based on something that happened in their past.
Peekaboo is fun for babies, no matter what stage they're in. But for younger babies, it is quite a surprise to see a caregiver's face reappear after it has been hidden. But older babies who grasp this concept of object permanence understand that their parent still exists, even when they leave the room. Here is another example of object permanence. A younger baby might forget about a toy when it is placed under a blanket. However, a baby in the coordination of secondary circular reaction stage will search for the toy under the blanket. Like all of these stages, understanding doesn't happen overnight. It may take several months to grasp a concept like object permanence. At this stage, most babies are physically on the go. Not only are they able to move in a coordinated way, but they may plan how to get to a desired object. They may move one toy out of the way in order to get to another. They may pull themselves up onto furniture in order to reach something. Let's review this. Examine each stage.
Okay, so that was going through the first 4 substages of the sensory motor stage. There are a couple more. Substage 5 is called tertiary circular reactions. So in this stage, infants are usually around 12 to 18 months, and this is where you see them do deliberate variation of action to bring out a desired consequence. So for example, if they have a bouncy ball, they might drop it at a normal height, see what happens, and then hold it up really high, drop it from there and see what happens, and then maybe do like a low drop and see what happens. So they're kind of running like their own little experiments almost. And then the last substage is called the beginning of thought. This is from 18 to 24 months of age. So this is where you see a lot of capacity for mental representations. So they have images of past events or objects that are no longer in their current line of sight. And you also see deferred imitation, which is where even though a person is no longer present, the child may imitate that person. So you have, like if you saw mom pour cereal into a bowl, they might try to imitate that subject with their toys or something like that, even though mom's not currently in the room. And that's the last substage. So now we're going to move on to pre-operational. Oh, sorry, one thing before we move on. The one important thing I wanted you to catch from the end of that video was that physical development is really important for cognitive development. So as I stated at the beginning of class, like chapter 1, all of these areas of development really influence each other. So if a child had something wrong with their physical development, if they weren't able to crawl or walk or grasp objects, then they wouldn't be developing cognitively either, because in Piaget's view, those things are directly related. So their motor abilities are directly related to their experiences, which is how they grow cognitively in Piaget's view. Okay, so now the next stage is pre-operational, which is from ages 2 to 7. So this is about preschool age. So this stage is characterized by symbolic thinking. Mental reasoning and the use of concepts increases, but children are not yet capable of operations, which Piaget defined as organized, formal, logical mental processes. That's why it's called the pre-operational stage, because they can't do it yet. One key aspect of the pre-operational thought is symbolic function, which is the ability to use symbols, words, or an object to represent something that is not physically present. So symbolic function is directly related to language acquisition. So Piaget thought that your cognitive development is directly related to language. So if you don't have a word for something, you're not going to be able to do those symbolic functions that he was talking about. So some of the key things in pre-operational stage are what I have on the slide here. So centration is the process of concentrating on one limited aspect of a stimulus and ignoring other aspects. So this is a major characteristic of pre-operational thought. It's also a major limitation of this period because it leads to inaccuracy of thought. So if you're presented with a problem and you can only look at one limited aspect of that problem, you're likely not going to come to the correct answer. So because children in the pre-operational stage have this centration problem, that means that they're not able to solve conservation problems, which we're going to watch an example of in a second. But conservation is the knowledge that quantity is unrelated to the arrangement and physical appearance of objects. So because children in pre-operational stage have this centration problem, they cannot solve conservation problems. So let's watch an example of that. So again, one second while I switch my screen. Two rows of quarters. Okay, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they
The same.
the same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
Because it's stretched out?
Yeah.
Okay, so how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So, are there more in this row, or are they the same? The same?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we have two sticks. Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? What about now? Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
That stick is longer.
The stick is longer?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because you moved it over.
So now it's longer.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me. Okay, it seemed like the video maybe wasn't sharing correctly, so I'll post that in the supplemental file so you can watch it again if you want to. There's a lot of different tasks in that video, so you don't need to watch the whole thing. But the main point I wanted you to get was, so like with the quarter example, the child wasn't able to understand that just because she spread the quarters out, that doesn't mean that there are more quarters now in that row. So that's a great example of a conservation problem. Another one that is in the video is they'll take two glasses filled with the same amount of water, and she'll take one of the glasses and pour it into a larger glass. That makes it look like the taller glass might have more water. So the child in this stage wouldn't be able to say, well, you didn't actually add more water, it's still the same. Older children are able to realize that nothing has changed in the amount of water that's there. Okay, so then the next one is egocentrism. So egocentric thought is thinking that does not take into account the viewpoint of others. And there's two different forms of this. So first of all, children have a lack of awareness that others see things from physical perspectives. I'm going to post a video on that since it doesn't appear to be working too well. I'll post it in your supplemental folder. So go ahead and pause here and you can watch that video on egocentrism. The second aspect of egocentric thought is that children fail to realize that others may hold thoughts, feelings, and points of view different from their own. So just because they're happy in one situation, they assume that everyone else is happy, when that's not necessarily the case. So they don't understand that other people have different thoughts and feelings. So you see egoism at the root of many preschool behaviors. So like preschool children tend to talk to themselves a lot. if they're playing hide and seek, they might cover their eyes and just stand in the middle of the room. And they think that because they can't see that no one else can either. So that's an example of how egocentrism affects their thought at this stage. Okay, so next is concrete operational. So this is from ages 7 to 12, so like your elementary school years. Again, I'll post this video in the supplemental folder, so you can go ahead and pause here and watch that. Basically, what it's showing you is that now children are able to solve those kinds of conservation problems easily. That's due to a process called decentering, where their thought becomes less egocentric and they can take in multiple aspects of a situation to solve a problem. So they also have a concept of reversibility, which is realizing that a stimulus can be reversed, returning to its original form. So they understand that just because you poured water into a different shaped glass doesn't mean that you actually added water to that glass. So they still have the same amount. With the quarter example, they would be able to easily tell you that nothing has changed. Each row still has the same amount of quarters. Just because one is stretched out doesn't mean that it has more quarters in it. Okay, so one note on this is that although we do see great advances here, they are still tied to concrete physical reality and cannot understand abstract or hypothetical reasoning, which you'll start to see when we move on to formal operations. And again, I'll post this video for you to watch. Really what it here is what abstract thinking, hypothetical reasoning looks like. So I think the example your textbook gives is if you were to give an assignment that asked children to write about how their lives might be different if America hadn't won its independence from Britain, children in the pre-operational stage wouldn't be able to write that paper because they can't, that's not a ground in reality. It's a hypothetical question that they wouldn't be able to answer, but adolescents would be able to answer that question really simply. One interesting thing to note about this is because of their ability to question things and think abstractly, adolescents start to analyze things a lot more. So this might make them more argumentative, both with parents and with teachers. So before children just kind of accept that the rules are what they are, at this stage, adolescents start to find flaws in your rules. So again, I think an example in your textbook was if, as a parent, you tell them that they're not allowed to smoke, they might find out that you smoked when you were in college. So they're like, well, why was it okay for you and it's not okay for me? So you start to see those kinds of things happen. Adolescents may also appear indecisive as they consider multiple sides of an issue before making choices. So again, that's because of that process of decentering that happened in pre-operational, where you can take multiple viewpoints on to try to solve a problem. Okay, and like I said, there's more. This is the end of Piaget's theory, but there's more theories that take into adulthood into account and what kind of changes we might be going through there. So I would suggest that you read those in your textbook. But for now, we're going to move on to talking Vygotsky's view of cognitive development. So Vygotsky is a little different. With Piaget, what you're thinking in terms of our nature and nurture issue, Piaget's view of cognitive development would definitely fall more on the nature side, where it's based more on our physical development, so more of a biological view. Again, in his view, everyone is going through these stages just kind of in the same exact order, and it just happens like once your brain hits a certain level of physical maturation, then you move on to the next stage. With Vygotsky's view, he leans a little more towards nurture, where it's more about your environment and your social surroundings, your culture comes into play a lot here. So according to Vygotsky, you're going to see differences in cognitive development based on the culture that you grow up in. He also sees children as little apprentices learning from the adults around them. So basically, you're constantly learning from your parents, from your teachers, maybe your older siblings, your peers, and it's going to be culturally based. So it could be things like, school things like learning math and reading, but it also might be something specific to your culture, like how to cook a certain type of dish or something like that, that you have to learn from your elders, essentially. So according to Vygotsky, children's cognitive abilities increase when information is provided within their zone of proximal development. So the zone of proximal development is the level at which children can almost, but not fully, perform a task independently, but they can complete the task with the assistance of someone more competent in that task. So again, the zone of proximal development is the level at which a child can almost but not fully perform a task by themselves, and they can complete that task if they have assistance from someone who is more competent in that task. Whenever a child's learning how to read, they have those reading level books. So it might be like it goes from like level 1 to level 2 to level 3, and they get harder or challenging as they move up. So if you have a child who can easily read levels 1 through 4, but they struggle with a level 5, that means that according to their zone of proximal development, they need to be working on a level 5 book, because they can almost do it by themselves, but they can't do it without help. So as a parent or a teacher, you might sit next to them and help them sound out words that they're struggling with, and eventually they'll be able to do that by themselves and then move on to a level 6. So that process is called scaffolding, which is where you're supporting the person, you're encouraging them to solve problems on their own, you're encouraging independence and growth. So essentially you're just helping them out, but you're not giving them the answers. So the video I was going to post show for this was just an example of reading where it doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher or an adult. If you have a peer who's more competent in a task, they can help their peers who are struggling. So the example was a child was reading a book and he was struggling with some words, so one of his peers was helping him sound out the words. So you'll see this a lot in schools where they group children together based on their level of competency. So they'll have some children who are more competent in the task helping children who are less competent. We do this even in face-to-face classes now, where when you do group work, you're learning from each other. And when we have discussion, the point is to learn from each other. Someone might have a different experience, they might be more knowledgeable than you, and they can offer a different viewpoint. So that's why that's really important. So again, remember that the differences between those two, the main thing is that for Piaget, he believed our cognitive development was mostly biological and had to do with the physical maturation of the body and the brain, whereas Vygotsky places a lot more emphasis on our cultural upbringing, your social surroundings, and this zone of proximal development.